supply chains in an uncertain summer, the latest on cargo theft, and prioritizing sustainability. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories, as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. Hi, I'm Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by Zebra Robotics Automation. How can you drive down your cost per unit and make every movement count? Read Zebra Robotics Automation's latest ebook, Unlocking Fulfillment Potential, to learn how their Zebra Symmetry fulfillment ecosystem was engineered to boost your profits. You'll discover a unique threefold strategy that enables workers to pick more items in less time, with up to 30% fewer robots compared to legacy systems. Download it now at zebra.com/fulfillment. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, this past week a number of economic numbers came out. On Tuesday, the Consumer Price Index showed some rise in inflation. A few major banks also reported strong earnings, and we saw some evidence of strong consumer confidence during Prime Days. Yet all of these reports came in the midst of the ongoing tariff and trade uncertainty. Where are supply chains at and where they're going as we begin the second half of 2025? To find out, I spoke with Zac Rogers, Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management at Colorado State University. He's also the lead author of the monthly Logistics Managers Index report. Here's our conversation. Welcome, Zac. It's good to have you back with us again on Logistics Matters.
It's great to be here, Dave.
Zac, a lot of industry numbers were released this past week. We saw some inflation numbers. We saw some strong earnings from banks. So what does this whole take on the economy mean for supply chains right now? Are we still really in a period of uncertainty, or do we have any kind of direction?
There's absolutely uncertainty, and the reason for the uncertainty largely has been the changing trade regulations. The week that we're recording this, we've seen changes in tariffs on copper, Brazil, Mexico, Canada, China, the EU, Russia. I mean, we're seeing trade policy change sort of all over the place, and it makes it really difficult for supply chains to optimize inventory flows. As you and the listeners know, supply chains are mostly built on the concept of just-in-time or JIT inventory, when things come in right before we need it. And what that does is it allows us to better utilize our physical assets like warehouses and trucks and dock space in the supply chain, and also keep costs low. The JIT really relies on certainty. We have to know when things will get here, how much they will cost, and how the flows will move. Well, with the tariffs, we no longer know when things will show up and what the cost will be. And so because of that, we've seen a huge front loading really throughout the year. This story really started in January, February, and March. If you look at movements and inventories, looked a lot like movements we would normally see in like August, September, and October leading into the holiday season. So we brought this huge sort of bubble of inventories into the country in Q1. Now, that ended up being really beneficial on the consumer side, because a lot of what people have bought through the first 6 months of the year from like retailers are things that came in through the first 3 months. And so it's sort of, insulated consumers from the very worst sort of cost load of the tariffs. Now, right now, we're still seeing a big surge in mid-July when we're speaking. And that surge is sort of a continuation of one that started in June. So we had, just to recap, a big first 3 months of the year with inventories coming in. And then in May, we kind of had what was called the air pocket, a dead zone, where not much came in. This was sort of post, the big tariff rollout on April 1st. And a lot of things had slowed down. At this point, we had 145% tariffs with China and all these really high numbers. Well, in late May, this relaxes and we see another flood of imports come in. And that really has continued up until now. If we look at data from the Port of Los Angeles, which I would, any listeners out there, I would recommend Look at the Port of Los Angeles signal. Every day they put out, hey, here's how many TEUs are coming. Here's empty containers. It's, the leading edge in many ways of the U.S. logistics economy are the things coming in through LA. So it's always a great sort of leading indicator resource. And if you look at the Port of LA, it seems like the big surge that we had in imports is slowing down now here in the final weeks of July going into early August. Not coincidentally, that's when the tariffs are at this point scheduled to go back into place. Now, will the tariffs go into place or not? I don't know if anybody knows that answer. But at this point, that's sort of when they're scheduled to go in. So what that means essentially is we've had kind of a big rush of inventories in. Now it looks like they're going to slow down, but they'll still need to matriculate downstream to retailers because, if like Prime Day, which is last week, is any indication, there is still resilience in the US consumer. And it seems like, at least at this point, that we'll have a fairly solid Q3 and Q4, at least on the retail side.
Zach, should shippers pay attention at all to any of this tariff news? Because it seems like everything does get delayed. A lot of people think it's just a negotiating tactic.
Mhm.
Consumers certainly haven't seemed to be pulling back a lot, although things are starting to get a little more expensive. How should people react right now? And should tariffs be taken seriously?
I think at some level they have to be taken seriously. I mean, look, it seems unlikely that we're really going to go back to 145% tariffs with China. I mean, 145% tariff, another good word for that would be trade embargo. I mean, it's unlikely, it seems like, that we'll be able to do that. Plus, there's certain components that are tariffed right now that we can't make anywhere else. One of my former students, I was talking to him last week, he's in charge of sourcing the sort of rare earths and magnets from China. He works for an aviation company, and he was saying there's really nowhere else on the planet these can come from. And luckily, they were very smart and built up big stores of inventory ahead of time. But he's like, if the tariffs come back, I don't know what we're going to do. And there's so many companies that will be in that same position. I think you have to take it seriously because, partly it's unclear what tariffs are going to stick around and what won't. And what it seems to me, if I'm, reading The Art of the Deal and negotiations, clearly the strategy is come out with it's called the anchoring effect. It's something we teach in class here at Colorado State. All right, if I want a 20% increase in, say, tariffs, well, going from 0 to 20 is a pretty drastic jump. But if instead I say, I'd like 100% increase, and then we negotiate it and we get down to 20, well, now compared to that 100% tariff, 20 doesn't seem so rough anymore, but it is still 20% increased cost. And I would imagine that is the end goal. It seems very unlikely that we're going to go back to the tariff policies that we had before this administration. It's unlikely they'll be as high as the highest proposals, but they'll still probably be there.
20% is still rather high compared to what tariffs have been in the past. So what's that going to do to our pricing and our inflation, which we have seen sneak up and which will probably delay interest rate cuts?
Both of those things are going to happen. Yes. So, an increase in 20% will lead to some slowdowns in consumer spending. Like we said, consumers so far have really been insulated from a lot of the price increases. The things that have been bought through the first half of the year are mostly goods that came in pre-tariff. And so consumers haven't really had the full brunt of 30, 40, 45% tariffs. That will probably, though, be reflected more in holiday shopping. And I think, for portions of back to school, not things like electronics where there's carve outs, but for things like apparel, books, those will see that 30 to 40% tariff increase. Now, the full 30 to 40% won't be passed down to consumers, but some of it will. The other piece of it is, even setting aside the cost of getting goods into the country, the cost of having goods inside the country has gone up. We have right now really, really high levels of inventories. And because of that, in this last month's most recent logistics index, we actually saw inventory costs. So the rate of change at which we're holding inventories, what the cost of holding inventories is, went all the way up to 80.9. And just for reference, the last time it was this high was October of 2022, when we were sort of in the post-COVID bullwhip, when we had way too much inventory on hand. So we're seeing the highest rate of change for inventory costs that we've seen in the last 3 years. And actually, every reading that we've had in 2025 has been over 70. And anything 70 and over is a really accelerated, significant rate of change. We also see warehousing capacity is contracting, and it's contracting for the first time since 2023. And so we have a tighter market, like basically we're running out of space to hold all this stuff. And because of that, we're seeing costs go up. And so, Dave, yeah, there's the cost to bring it in, the tariffs, but then there's also the cost to just have it sitting in the US, because like we said at the beginning here, supply chains are built to be perpetual motion machines where everything moves very quickly. Right now, instead of having dynamic inventories, we're having static inventories. And anytime you have static inventories, there's just the cost of holding on to this stuff. And that cost is likely to be passed down to the consumers as well.
I would venture to say that the costs you're talking about are directly related to interest rates. We're not building because of the cost of capital to build new projects. We're also having to pay more on that inventory because many companies have to borrow for the inventory. So the interest rate cuts that we were expecting to get this year never materialized, and that's directly due to our trade policies.
Oh, that's exactly right. I think going into this year, all of our metrics on the LMI looked like 2025 was really going to be the bounce back year. We had the big swing up in 20 and 21, and then things came crashing down in 22, slowly, really hit the trough in sort of mid 23. July 23 is when we were just the absolute nadir of especially on the transportation side, but of the logistics industry. And then we slowly in 2024 started to see a turnaround, and it looked like everything was sort of primed for 2025 to be a great year for supply chains. And then the tariffs threw a ton of uncertainty into the system. And you're right, because of that, it's unclear how costs are going to increase. And if you're sitting at the Fed, well, gosh, if costs are going to bump up suddenly, it's not a great idea to start lowering interest rates, because that could just add fuel to the fire in terms of price inflation. And so I think the Fed coming into 2025, I mean, we had cuts at the end of 2024. I think going into 2025, the hope was, hey, maybe 4 or 5 cuts, this would be great. And now we're sitting here in the middle of July, closer to the end of the year than to the beginning of the year, and we haven't had cuts. And so I think you're absolutely right. This change in policy has added all this cost to supply chains, and they're not getting any relief in the form of interest rates reductions because of that same uncertainty that led them to bring those costs on in the first place.
Zach, as you mentioned, we're getting into peak season now. Instead, it's been front-loaded peak season so far. We also have back to school, which is the second largest time of the year for retailers. How do you see these two major periods of retail sales playing out through the end of the year?
Well, like we saw last week, Prime Day, even though it was Prime Day is now 4 days, was still fairly strong, and so I do think there will still be consumer demand. Christmas Day will still be December 25th. Kids will still go back to school at the end of August or beginning of September, so there will still be the shopping. Now, one thing that's different about this year because of the front loading is that we're not seeing a traditional peak season. We sort of are having a bifurcated peak season. And what I mean by that is generally going into peak season, we'll see the really big rushes of goods coming in, July, August, moving to retailers September, October. And usually it's like the middle of October, like October 14th, 15th, we'll see retail inventories really peak and then be sold through the rest of Q4 and the holiday shopping. Well, this year, all that inventory on the front side is already here. Because of front loading, it's unlikely that we're going to see big rushes coming from, the ports in August and September. Essentially, most of that inventory is already here that we're going to need for the holiday season. And right now it's sitting in these middle mile warehousing locations in places like, the Inland Empire and traditional places, but also Phoenix, Dallas, Atlanta, Las Vegas, places like that. When we go forward to September, that's when we're likely to see that stuff sitting at the middle mile finally start to move to retailers. And so what that means is that sort of the first half of peak season, like the inbound port stuff, that already happened. The second half of peak season, where things move to the retailers, that's coming in maybe a month or two. Because of the bifurcation, that volume is more distributed over time than it normally is, which means that we'll have more supply in the transportation market to cover demand. So for shippers, that's a good thing because we probably will have more transportation capacity in September and October than we normally would because of that bifurcation. For carriers, that is the opposite. That's kind of a bad thing because we won't see freight charges probably go up as much, especially on the spot market, as we normally would during that time because everything, no one is rushing out to the West Coast to get all the last minute imports. Now, there could be, another surge of imports, possibly if we see tariffs go down again, and there's a chance that it will. But it's even if tariffs go down to zero, it's unlikely that we'll see a big surge in September and October just because we already have so much inventory in the system.
Well, it certainly looks like it'll continue to be our summer of uncertainty, and who knows as we go through the rest of the year.
Yeah, it's exciting, isn't it?
Well, it is a very interesting time to report on supply chains. I do have to say that. I don't know that I'd want to be an actual supply chain manager right now, having to deal with it all.
Oh yeah, it's nice to just talk about it in some ways. One last thing though, I gotta say, it is a credit though that it has gone as smoothly as it has. Because we really are operating in so much uncertainty. The folks that are actually the boots on the ground, the people listening to the show, have done a phenomenal job. Really over, we've had a decade of disruptions at this point, really. And just the level to which we've seen resilience through supply chains that even with all these changes, we're not seeing empty shelves. We're not seeing huge spikes in prices. At least we're not seeing it yet. And that's a credit actually to the people who do actually do this for a living and are probably listening right now that things have gone this smoothly with this level of disruption.
I agree with that. And we were talking as a staff a couple of days ago that really the pandemic was such a good training ground for
Mm-hmm.
resiliency that I would have hated to face this uncertainty that we're feeling right now without having learned so many lessons through the
Yeah,
pandemic.
absolutely. This would have been much more difficult 5 years ago.
We have been talking to Zac Rogers. He's an associate professor of supply chain management at Colorado State University and the lead author of the Logistics Managers Index. Zac, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for again joining us today on Logistics Matters.
Oh, thank you. It's always a lot of fun.
Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And Ben, we've reported regularly on the ongoing problem of cargo theft, and you have some new information on a released report on the seriousness of the problem. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I'm glad to. This report touched on exactly what thieves are stealing and how they're doing it. So, first of all, the numbers show that overall cargo theft is up. It surged in the second quarter of this year, from March to June, rising 13% compared to that same period in 2024, and rising 10% from the first quarter of this year. That data comes from CargoNet. That's a company that says it can help prevent cargo theft and improve recovery rates when it does happen through better information sharing among theft victims and their business partners and law enforcement. So that's their general prescription for trying to slow this down. The increase in the second quarter produced a total of 884 supply chain theft events across the US and Canada. And as a note, that this second quarter, while it was up, this has been going on for a little while. It was not a blip. The theft numbers were also up about a comparable amount in April, in May, and in June.
Well, of course, Ben, theft can be expensive and it can cause problems for both shippers and carriers. But you said you also had some details about how that theft is actually happening.
Exactly. So looking further into the details, the most dramatic increase in that second quarter bump by category was in the theft of metals. And those nearly doubled. They had a 96% year over year surge. That growth coincides with copper is trading lately near or above its record highs. And that suggests that organized crime groups strategically adjust their targeting based on commodity market values, according to CargoNet. Another area that saw big growth was food and beverage products. That had a almost 70% increase from second quarter of last year. And this category now accounts for more than a fifth of all cargo thefts, counting alcoholic beverages, energy drinks, meat products, things like that. So, talking about those details, CargoNet says that the strategic targeting of specific commodities reveals the business-like approach of modern cargo theft operations. And Keith Lewis, who's an executive at the company, said these are not opportunistic crimes. They're calculated operations targeting goods that have the highest illicit market value and the easiest resale potential. So CargoNet's conclusion is that these are complex cargo theft schemes involving methods like document fraud and identity theft. The operations are often perpetrated, they said, by international organized crime groups, and also they're evolving rapidly to try to change and circumvent the industry anti-fraud efforts that are trying to keep up.
Yeah, there are a lot of smart criminals out there. Thought it was interesting that you noted the copper was one of the items that is targeted, and of course, those have also been a commodity that's seen a lot of the tariff regulation or proposed new tariffs on copper, which has also driven up the price and the value of copper.
Yeah, interesting point. This is all tied together.
So it is continuing to be a problem, theft in our industry, and requires everyone really in the supply chain to remain diligent and aware and report what you see and hopefully we can lower some of these numbers of cargo theft, but it is a continuing problem.
It sure is, and we'll continue to cover it.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
And Victoria, despite changing sentiment about ESG initiatives, many business executives remain firm in their commitment to sustainability. What are you hearing?
Yeah, Dave, that's right. So there was a sustainability report out this week that shows that companies are still focused on this issue, despite, as you say, a scaling back of ESG oversight, really since the change of administration in Washington this year. Just a quick reminder, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and these are criteria that investors and others use to evaluate a company's impact on society and the environment, kind of in a nutshell. So this was a survey from sustainability ratings provider EcoVadis, and the company polled 400 U.S. executives at companies with more than $1 billion in revenue, and they were from industries that include consumer, industrial, technology, and services. And the key takeaway is that 87% of those companies say they have maintained or increased their investment in business sustainability efforts this year, with many saying they are doing so sort of behind the scenes amid that growing regulatory debate and uncertainty over the role of those corporate ESG-related programs.
Well, Victoria, that's certainly good news that companies are staying focused on sustainability efforts. Did the survey elaborate on what's driving that, given the shifting priorities in Washington and elsewhere that you mentioned?
Yes, it did. Essentially, they're maintaining the focus because they say these efforts basically bear fruit. Nearly two-thirds of the companies surveyed said supply chain sustainability gives them a competitive edge in the marketplace. Specifically, they said sustainability helps them grow faster through things like risk reduction, resilience, brand enhancements, supply chain performance, and cost savings. On top of that, 62% of company directors and vice presidents and 59% of C-suite leaders say it helps attract and retain customers. And a majority of finance leaders that were polled in the report, 52%, agreed with the sentiment as well, saying that sustainability is a growth driver. So this report outlines some other trends that are shaping corporate supply chain sustainability strategy. Our listeners can get more information by checking out the story online or in our podcast notes section.
That's great. And I guess this report also shows that regardless of what many may be saying or hearing coming out of our government, business leaders still recognize that sustainability is a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we all want to be good stewards of the environment.
Agreed. Thank you, Victoria.
You're welcome.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank Zac Rogers of Colorado State University for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. Speaking of subscribing, check out our sister podcast series, Supply Chain in the Fast Lane, co-produced by the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals and Supply Chain Exchange. We just released the second in a new 8-episode series on the top threats to our supply chains. The new episodes will drop each Tuesday for the next 6 weeks. Check out Supply Chain in the Fast Lane wherever you get your podcasts. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by Zebra Robotics Automation. Imagine how your operation could benefit from flexible autonomous mobile robots that enable more efficient picking and a wider range of products while handling up to 300% more cubic capacity. Zebra's cutting-edge Zebra Symmetry Fulfillment Solution is engineered to reduce your cost per unit and give you that unbeatable competitive edge. Don't settle for less. Maximize your profits with Zebra. Discover the future of fulfillment at zebra.com/fulfillment. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.